Thank you very, very much for being here. I'm Nicholas Berggruen, so welcome. I very much appreciate you being here, but frankly, I have to thank our visitor, Rabbi Sacks. So I won't be very long because you want to hear from him, not from me. Rabbi Sacks is well known. He's well known in a number of different ways. He was the head of the British Jewry, but beyond his, let's say, administrative functions, he's really a thinker. And that's what we at the Institute, the Berggruen Institute, care about, are people who think. And if you think about religions, they're in some ways the ultimate world of thoughts, because the worlds, they help us think about who we are, where we come from, where we might go, who we want to be. And having discussions, I have found, with religious thinkers are some of the most meaningful discussions you can have. And as we talked a little bit about before, with some of the representatives of other religions, all religions seem to share sort of the same general goal. And I think that's very important these days, for sure. And but it also teaches us that, one, we're all humans, and humans share the need and the quest to believe in something, to belong. And tonight, I'm extraordinarily grateful that we not only have Rabbi Sacks and friends who live here in Los Angeles, but also representatives of many of the key other religions. So I think this is a treat to all be together. So thank you, Rabbi Sacks.
Thank you so much, Nicholas, friends. Privileged to be in your company. Forgive me for using a lectern. I gather usually it's slightly less formal. The reason I'm using a lectern is because there's 8 hours time difference between. So although I seem to be in Los Angeles, my mind is still back in Britain, and I don't speak terribly well with jet lag. What I do find is that when I get up with jet lag, I am like the man, the English aristocrat, who dreamt he was giving a speech in the House of Lords and woke up to discover he was. So I'll try my best to stay roughly intelligible, but my thanks to the Institute for hosting us this evening and for all its work. A special thanks to Rachel for facilitating it. She's amazing. And Nicholas, I can't thank you enough for all you have given the world of ideas, for taking ideas seriously, for thinking long. Do you know how rare that is in the West today? I do something on BBC called Thought for the Day in the main news program, and 15 years ago they cut it from 3 minutes to 2 minutes 45 seconds on the grounds that no one can concentrate for 3 minutes. Wow. So thinking short we do very well indeed, but thinking long, which is what we need, is what Nicholas is encouraging us to do. And I want to say special thanks to you, Nicholas, and to Nathan for your incredible book, Renovating Democracy, which if you haven't yet read, you really must. It is really exceptional. Some time ago, for the last 4 or 5 years, I've been teaching at NYU. And the wonderful president then of NYU, John Sexton, I asked him, John, what shall I talk about? And he said, talk about your next book. So that's what I'm going to do this evening, if I may. The next book called, it'll be out in Britain in March and in America in September, and it's called Morality, Recovering the Common Good in a Divided Age. And I just want to really give you a sort of prequel or a trailer or whatever it is, and let's begin this way. In 1962, Rachel Carson published a book called Silent Spring. And that is widely credited with initiating environmental awareness, or as we would call it today, climate change, a subject of an interesting exchange of views at the moment between the 45th President of the United States and a 17-year-old Swedish schoolgirl. It's a wonderful debate and thrilling, but it's long overdue. I want to talk about a similar phenomenon which is hardly being debated at all, and I call it cultural climate change. And it begins roughly at the same time, back in the early 1960s while Rachel was doing her book. And we can think about it in a number of ways. Number one, has any of you ever used something called a Google Ngram? Do you know that? Google have digitized vast libraries of literature, including every book published in America and Britain since the late 18th century. So they take you can run a search through all books published for the incidence of any given word or combination of words. And you will see that certain words appear at certain times out of nowhere, and certain words that have been used pretty much the same for many years suddenly zoom up. And if you do a Google Ngram, you will find that beginning in 1964, there is suddenly a rise, a steep rise, in the incidence of the word I. Or you could do something else, which is, as one university professor has done, analyze the language of pop lyrics from 1960s to today. And you will see there too, you know, in the 50s, pop songs were about we, about us being together. And since then, the preponderance has been on I. There is a long journey from Simon and Garfunkel to Eminem. And it's a long journey, right? So that is number two. Or number three, the sudden appearance in the 1960s, really, of a whole cluster of words beginning with self. Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, self-actualization, self-realization, self-fulfillment. Or a word that had a huge impact here in California on the education system, Nathaniel Branden's publication of a book in 1968, which put into the mainstream the phrase, the word self-esteem. Suddenly everything is about the self. Suddenly you get the move chronicled by Lionel Trilling from sincerity to authenticity. Suddenly you get led by great English jurist H.L.A. Hart in lectures he gave at Stanford in 1962, an insistence that the most important legal value is autonomy, my right to do my thing. All of these things are happening at the same time, and that is cultural climate change. And we are living in the consequences of that. The shift from a balance of we and I to the dominance of I over we. And just as with the other climate change, it didn't begin in 1962. It's just that people started noticing it and acting on it in 1962. If you want to trace the history back to this obsession with the I, then the first port of call would be the French existentialists. Move back a little more, you get to Nietzsche. Move back a little more, you get to Kierkegaard, perhaps the first existentialist. Move back a little more, and you get that snappily titled book of Immanuel Kant, The Prolegomena to the Metaphysics of Morals. And for the first time, Kant puts the word autonomy center field in moral discourse. Move back a little further, you get Descartes, I think, therefore I am, and move back further still, and you get Luther, 1517, and here I stand, I can do no other. So it's got a long prehistory, but it becomes really powerful in the 1960s, and like with everything, we didn't think long. Because it was initially a great liberation, and it was and is a great liberation. I don't want to deny that for 1 second. But the thing is that, as with climate change, so with cultural climate change, there are many belated effects, and we can see them now. So, number one, the fragmentation of the body politic. Number two, political extremes and populism. Number 3, a market economy that many see as inequitable. And Nicholas has alerted us to the possible impact on employment of artificial intelligence. There's the epidemic of loneliness, which has become a major issue in the States, and so big an issue in Britain that the government already, for the last couple of years, has appointed a minister for loneliness. It's that serious. Or against loneliness, maybe I should have said. And then this massive rise since 2013 in depression, self-harm, and God forbid suicides among teenage kids, especially teenage girls, because of the impact of social media. They're all focusing on how do I look to others. And Jean Twenge of the University of California, San Diego, wrote the book iGen, published last year, the definitive account of this. And if you look at levels of teenagers' self-reported happiness, it stays stable until 2013 and suddenly plummets. The level of self-harm and, God forbid, attempted suicides, stable, and 2013 suddenly rises up. In Britain, in some respects, it's even worse. According to a figure in The Guardian, 1/4 of teenage girls aged 14 in Britain has self-harmed. Now that is huge. And all of this, they all have their individual etiologies, and I'm not going to simplify any of them, but all of this has something to do with this failure of connectedness that is represented by the word we. Cultural climate change does not threaten the future of life on Earth like real climate change, but it does threaten the future of Western democratic freedom. And I want to ask why that freedom depends on more than I. And I want to begin with a moment, a really interesting moment, when Charles Darwin sees a problem with his theory that threatens to undermine, even refute, his theory of natural selection. And I'll tell you a way of seeing his problem. Did any of you see the film about Alan Turing called The Imitation Game? You remember? You see what's his name? Benedict Cumberbatch, who plays Alan Turing, and there's this nice lady mathematician, Keira Knightley, and she's trying to tell him he's got to be a bit human. And she says, tell a joke, which is not a great piece of advice. So he goes into the team that are trying to crack the German Enigma code, and he tells them the following story. There are two adventurers in a jungle, 2 explorers, and they hear the roar of a lion. The first one searches for a place where the 2 of them can hide or escape. The second one starts putting on his running shoes. The first one says to the second one, "How? You're crazy. You can't run faster than a lion." And the second one turns to the first one and says, "I don't need to run faster than the lion. I just need to run faster than you." Now, if you work that one out in Darwinian terms, the egoist, who is interested only in his own survival, lives, whereas the altruist, who's trying to help them both survive, dies. Now, Darwin saw this. He realized that anyone who risked his life for the sake of others would likely die young before he or she could pass their genes on to the next generation. And therefore, in the language of today, or in a metaphor of today, the gene for altruism should have gone extinct. And yet, said Darwin, everywhere you go, you will find altruism and altruists praised and highly regarded. So how do you fit those two together? And it bothered him for many, many years. He eventually solved the problem. And he wrote it not in Origin of Species, but in The Descent of Man. And he said, any group whose members make sacrifices for the sake of one another will be a stronger group than another group where everyone's only out there for their own survival, their own interests. And therefore, the altruistic group will survive. Or to put it in language of today, we pass on our genes as individuals, but we survive only as groups, and groups are made out of altruism, out of we rather than I. In other words, what Darwin told us is that we need to compete, but we also need to cooperate. No system that only has one or the other will survive. You need both. And that is extremely important. We need the we of cooperation alongside the I of competition. As individuals, we can pursue self-interest, but as groups, we have to work for the common good. Now, how then does cooperation arise? How do selfish individuals ever become cooperative ones? And here, there's been a lot of work done since the 1970s in biology, in evolutionary psychology, and in game theory. And we know now the two primary mechanisms. The first one, it came from, well, J.B.S. Haldane, the scientist, was once asked, would you dive into a river and risk your life for the sake of your brother? To which he replied, no, but I would do for the sake of 2 brothers or 8 cousins. How so? Because you share half of your genes with your sibling and 1/8 of your genes with your cousins, right? So self-sacrifice is okay because it still hands your genes on to the next generation. And that is called kin selection. And that is why the most generous and altruistic behavior you will find in families. It's always between people with whom we're genetically related. That's basic. And that's true even of many animal species, not just of human species. That's basic. That's mechanism 1. Mechanism 2 is called reciprocal altruism. I may need your help one day, so when you need my help, I'm going to give it because I expect you to return the favor sometime. And that is reciprocal altruism. Even vampire bats practice reciprocal altruism because you never know if you've caught some blood today, are you going to find some tomorrow? Maybe not. Maybe it'll be the other bat who does so. So you will share a little of your blood with the other vampire bats and they will share with you. So reciprocal altruism also works for small groups. And those are not genetically related individuals, but they are members of the same small group. So we now know, as a result of all this scientific work, that the 2 primary mechanisms of morality are kin selection, family feeling, and reciprocal altruism. The trouble with reciprocal altruism is it only works for small groups. Because you have to remember whom you can trust to repay the good. There is an Oxford scientist called Robin Dunbar who worked out that you can work out how much brain power you need, and you can look at the size of the brains of different animals and work out what their optimum size of group will be. So you've got various social animals, chimpanzees, dolphins, etc. Even lions do this, etc., etc. Wolves hunt in a pack. So the optimum size may be 8, 12, whatever it is. He worked out by calculation of the size of the human brain that the optimal group, size of group, where you know everyone, you remember their name, and can you trust them is? What would you guess? 3. 150, right? 150 is the optimal size of group. I was talking about this to the military chaplains in Sandhurst in the military training academy, and I told them this, and they said, oh, it's funny you should say that. There are exactly 150 military chaplains. Yeah. So, you know, it's any bigger than that. So civilization, human civilization, faced a critical point when kin selection and reciprocal altruism weren't good enough. When did this happen? When we moved from hunter-gatherer to agriculture. Once you had agriculture, you had large populations that were static, living in one place, and you had the birth of towns and cities. And when that happens, kin selection doesn't work, and reciprocal altruism doesn't work, because you have to solve this problem. How do you establish trust between strangers? That was the key problem that human beings had to solve, without which we would never have had civilization. We'd still be hunter-gatherers. It is then that you get, for the first time in history, the emergence of large-scale religions. I don't mean primitive kind of religions which go way back. I mean religions with myths, with rituals, with temples, with priesthoods. Those appear alongside the birth of cities. And they solve the problem of trust between strangers. Why? Because they give some metaphysical justification for the social order. The Egyptians, for instance, in the Egypt of the pharaohs, believed in something called Ma'at, which is justice, cosmic order, and so on and so forth. And that became part of the shared mental reality of all Egyptians. It was celebrated in rituals, in festivals, in prayer, in sacrifices. And that solved the problem of trust between strangers. You then come to something else, much later, which is the birth of monotheism, beginning in the Hebrew Bible and then extended through Christianity and eventually Islam. And what monotheism is, you know, people think the difference between polytheism and monotheism is that was many gods, this is one God. That's not the real difference. The difference is that polytheism sanctified the social order. It was profoundly conservative. It was the canonization of the status quo. The head of state was the head of religion, always. And therefore it was really worship of the king, the ruler of the emperor, whatever, and the sacred hierarchy. Along comes the Hebrew Bible, Genesis 1. God creates every single human being in his image and likeness. All of a sudden, you have an encounter between one God and one human being, every one of us. The singular God and the single human being. And all of a sudden, you have the birth of the individual. That is really it, except that morally it makes a huge difference as well. And that is told in all those stories, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, and so on and so forth, where human beings are free to choose good or evil, and that is what it's all about. In ancient Mesopotamia, in ancient Egypt, etc., the moral order is out there. In monotheism, the moral order is in here. So, for instance, Oedipus fights against all the things the Delphic oracle has prophesied and fights in vain, but everything that happens to Oedipus has got nothing to do with Oedipus, and it's all factors outside him. There's no psychology to Oedipus. We know it's all going to end in tragedy. Whereas Shakespeare's Hamlet, already inhabiting this world of monotheism, all Hamlet's problems are in here. You know, when the native hue of resolution is sicklied all by the pale cast of thought, a situation that I find myself very often in. And one way or another, instead of the social order being some objective fact out there, becomes an individual form of conscience in here. And incidentally, this creates a new kind of morality. We are in with viral videos and public shaming through Twitter, etc., back into a very ancient culture indeed called shame. What monotheism creates is a new kind of culture altogether, which is about guilt. Shame is about what other people think of you. Guilt is what the inner voice tells you. So even if nobody knows except you, you still feel the guilt. That's a very highly internalized thing called the conscience. So to summarize this part of the argument, any social animal, any group needs to be able to do two things. It needs to be able to compete against other groups, but it needs to cooperate within itself. And there are three forms of cooperation. The first and most basic, within families, kin selection. The second, small groups, reciprocal altruism, you help me, I'll help you. And then thirdly, unique to humans, is morality. And that is what holds big groups of people together. It's a cultural artifact, it's a set of beliefs and a code of conduct, and it binds me in a network of obligations, where the point is to sustain the welfare of the group, extended in space and time. And that is the source of we consciousness on a large scale, without which we would still be hunter-gatherers. And that is the birth of the West, that particular conscience. How so? Here is my next point. Oops. Sorry, I've moved deeply into jet lag here. I'll tell you what happened. When all that stuff that I was talking to you about, all the I, all the self, all that kind of stuff, when that happened, people were experimenting and saying, could we have a society without the we? Can we base one on the I? And of course you can base one on the I. There are two institutions that are based on the I, and that is the state and the market, right? What is striking about them both is that the state and the market are arenas of competition. The state is about the competition for power. The market is about the competition for wealth. They're competitive arenas, which is fine, or it would be fine were it not for the fact that we have to do something else, which is to learn how to cooperate. We need a strong sense of we as well as I. And I want you to see how different the logic of morality is from the logic of the state and the market. Imagine that you have $1,000 and you decide one benign day to share it with 9 other people. How much do you have left? $100, 1/10 of what you began with. Imagine you have total power, like the synagogue president who used to say, all those in favor say aye, all those against say I resign. And you decide to share that with 9 others. How much power do you have left? 1/10 of what you began with. Now I want you to imagine that you have a certain amount of knowledge or friendship or influence or love, and you decide to share that with 9 others. How much do you have left? Probably more. Probably more. Because material goods like wealth and power work by division. Social goods like love and friendship work by multiplication. The reason is that with material goods, the more you share, the less you have. But with social goods, the more you share, the more you have. That is why social goods are the arena of cooperation and why we need that arena of cooperation. And that is why, when we had a strong sense of we were able to create, beginning with Milton and Locke in the 17th century and then Jefferson in the 18th century, free societies. I'll tell you why. Because people felt bound to one another by a moral code. They felt bound to respect the common good, not just my self-interest. People used words like duty, obligation, righteousness, honesty, integrity, courage, fortitude, fidelity. People knew that there are certain things you don't do. Even if you want to do them, you can afford to do them, and the law allows you to do them, but you still don't do them because it's not right. That is what allowed the modern state to emerge. What about the modern economy? Max Weber famously described the modern economy. He wrote a book called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Now, this was a kind of crazy theory. It had to do with predestination and earning rewards in the world to come. It was crazy theory, but there was something sound about it, because Protestants had this deeply internalized ethic. That meant you could trust them. And therefore you could do business with them. Even if you weren't a member of their family, even if you weren't a member of their small group, because they had this inner Google Maps, this inner ways that told you right from wrong, and therefore you could trust them, and therefore you could do business with strangers. That was why the market economy emerges in the 16th and 17th centuries in the wake of the Reformation, specifically really to do with Calvin, and it was that strict conscience that created the trust that allowed the market economy to give rise. And, you know, Edmund Burke, for instance, said something very powerful about the state. He said that the less control there is in here, the more control there has to be out there. In other words, the less your conscience stops you from doing something wrong, the more you need police to stop you doing something wrong. So Burke knew, and Alexis de Tocqueville knew in America, that you needed a very strong sense to have a free civil society. Otherwise, you would need extremely intrusive governments and very intrusive police force. So to sum up, the market economy and the liberal democratic state came into existence only because of the presence in England and America of a third factor, which was a strong society-wide moral code. And it was this that died somewhere in the 1960s. And since then, Western societies in general, and Britain and America in particular, have been running on empty. Trying to function on the basis of the state and market alone on arenas of competition, without that third thing, the arena of cooperation, which made the state and the market possible in the first place. That is what I mean by cultural climate change. How does it work out in principle? Well, I haven't got time to tell you, so read the book. But let me just give you some simple examples. In 2002, a very fine man, I don't know if you know the name, the late Arnold Weinstock, the late Lord Weinstock, probably the name didn't come over here. For 40 years, son of poor Jewish immigrants, for 40 years Arnold Weinstock was Britain's leading industrialist. He ran a company called GEC, the General Electric Company. He was the role model for everyone. And if any business book wanted to tell you how to run a business, how to be a leader, it was Arnold Weinstock that was the first example. Arnold Weinstock, I only knew because he was a member of our synagogue. He religiously came one day a year. What? He came on Yom Kippur on the Day of Atonement, doubtless for my sins, not for his. And at any rate, he came to me towards the end of his life. He died 3 or 4 months later. And he said to me this. He said, look, you know what I built up. He built this up into the greatest industrial complex in Britain. And everyone loved him and respected him and so on. He said to me, I paid myself £400,000 a year. That was, you know, generous sum, but not special. He said, since I retired, my successor pays himself 10 times as much, and he is destroying everything I built. If you want to read about this, you will read about GEC and how Weinstock's successor caused the most cataclysmic destruction of a company there ever was. Why? Because Arnold Weinstock kept the we. He knew that a leader of a business has to be responsible not just to shareholders, not just to employees, to customers, to everyone. He felt this deeply, and it was his concern was a moral concern, that his successor just wasn't interested in the morality of the business. And that is an exceptionally powerful statement of what was lost, and it hurt him very much indeed. And he died a broken man. I can't say that I know George Soros very well, but I do know that George Soros in his early days says it took, the first thing he had to do in his business was for 2 or 3 years to establish his character. People had to know this is a man we can trust. He said, nowadays, it's got nothing to do with relationships. It's become transactional. Forget character. Just make sure you've got the lawyers. That's what happens when you lose this sense of we, of responsibility for others. Number 2, and one of your special people, Anthony Appiah and Francis Fukuyama and Mark Lilla, have all written about the emergence in America of what they call identity politics. Identity politics is a direct consequence of one of the most ill-conceived government policies ever, and this was adopted in every single country in Europe, called multiculturalism. It was an absolute catastrophe because it dethroned the concept of one culture in which we are all members and said instead there are as many cultures as there are minorities in a country. I wrote a book about this because I thought it was an absolute disaster. Subsequently, published in 2007, The Home We Build Together. Subsequently, Monsieur Sarkozy, Angela Merkel, and virtually every prime minister in Europe said, we made a mistake in going down the multicultural route. When you do this, when you say a nation is no more than the minorities that make it up, you create segregation instead of integration. And you kill that fundamental principle of American politics in the preamble, the opening words of the preamble to the Constitution, we the people. That means all the people. This means we all have responsibility for one another. And that is what happens when you lose the we from politics. And I think, because I've already spoken for my allocated 30 minutes, I'm going to leave it there. And I'm going to say there are every other field you look, you will see that the overemphasis on the I and the underemphasis on the we is damaging everything and everyone. And we have to take this cultural climate change as seriously as the other and the real climate change. We need to recover that moral sense, or we will lose one of the greatest experiments in freedom that humanity has ever undertaken. We have enjoyed it for 4 centuries, but it is not guaranteed to last forever. The I of authenticity counts for a great deal, but so too does the we of the common good. Thank you.